All right, hello and welcome to the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network. My name is Jonah Shiffman. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, John Kelly. We are back for 2022, the first UFC card of the year going down this weekend. January 15th at the Apex, we got a main event between Calvin Kattar and Giga Chikadze. It'll be a 10-fight slate. We've lost a few fights throughout the course of the last few weeks. But John, we are back. It's exciting to have you back on the show, obviously. Pumped to get another year of this started. And how are you doing, my friend? How's the holidays? How's your new year? And are you as excited as I am to get started here in 2022?
I am very excited. Yeah, I'm doing well. I would be more excited if we didn't lose like half the card due to COVID and other pullouts. So that's kind of frustrating, but can't complain too much because we do have UFC back in our lives. You know, we've talked all the time, but I think I said it to you and a few other people. It's like the break is always nice for like that first week, especially like we grinded like 8 cards in a row or whatever it was. And so that first week off, you're like, like it's nice to have that break. And then literally by that second week, you're like, all right, why is there no fights? Like, what's going on here? So by the third and fourth week, I'm like, man, I'm really like jonesing for some UFC. So definitely happy to have it back here, even though, like you said, it is a short slate here, but there are at least 1 or 2 spots that I think we like. So I'm excited to talk through the fights and let's get after it.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I want to touch on before we get to the fights we do have 10 to break down is just kind of a consistent theme throughout this week. I think especially on DraftKings and the DFS street, specifically the DK pricing, as we've had a lot of late cancellations throughout fight week. Most notably will be the first 2 fights we talk about. So I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here, but we do have Charles Rosa stepping up as an underdog here on 4 days' notice against TJ Brown. TJ Brown was originally slated to be an underdog against Gabriel Benitez this weekend, is now a big favorite. He is at the lower echelon of the DK pricing. We have a similar situation with Brian Kelleher in the second fight of the night. So kind of a consistent theme that I think we should talk about throughout the show and I want people to be aware of is we have these fighters who are big favorites in their fights, but they're low priced on DraftKings, which makes it really easy to fit in a lot of fighters that are favored to win their fight. So I think it makes for, an interesting discussion on how to approach those situations, specifically for tournaments where I think guys like TJ Brown and Brian Kelleher will carry a lot of ownership, but we'll talk about those kind of individually as we go. Let's get started here, John. First fight of the night features the aforementioned TJ Brown. He's a -2 favorite, -250 favorite at current market. He's $7,100 on DraftKings, and he takes on Charles Rosa, who comes in here 4 days notice, maybe less actually. It might be 3 days at this point in time. Plus 210 underdog, $6,800 for Charles Rosa, and this will be the first fight of 2022. John, my friend, any hot takes off the presses here as we get started?
No hot takes. I mean, TJ Brown, he was supposed to fight your boy, Benitez. I always tease you about Benitez because it's like every time he's on the card, you bet him. But I was actually considering betting him against TJ Brown. So it was kind of unfortunate that he ended up falling off the card. But TJ Brown's a guy who we like in terms of DraftKings because he has that aggressive grappling style. The problem is he is super, super fragile. Like this dude, it seems like in all of his fights ends up getting hurt at some point. So he's definitely not somebody that you like to trust. But on the flip side, he's facing Charles Rosa, who outside of like an early submission hasn't really shown much to be afraid of. Like if the fight plays out on the feet, I'm not super worried, even though Brown's durability is always a concern. I'm not super worried because I don't think Rosa has a ton of power. And in terms of the grappling, like TJ Brown's a pretty solid grappler himself. We've seen Charles Rosa get taken down multiple times and controlled by just, decent wrestlers and wrestler grappler combo fighters. And that's kind of what TJ Brown is. And that's what I expect him to do here. So I do like the Brown side, but at -230 or whatever you said, like that's, I mean, I'm not betting Brown. I'll put it that way. But in terms of DraftKings, he's like $7,100 because of the pricing issue that you mentioned. So on DraftKings, it's going to be hard to fade him. Honestly, like I'm considering going 100% TJ Brown, which is kind of scary. But on these shorter slates, like you do need to make stands like that. So I'm wrestling back and forth. I'm either gonna go 100% or like if you're playing the main, like I might use a team or two without TJ Brown, but also not taking the other side in Charles Rosa because Charles Rosa is basically like early submission or he has no shot at the optimal. Like if he wins a decision, He's not scoring well. He doesn't do enough. He doesn't land takedowns. He doesn't throw in volume. So it's like this is a spot where I'm either targeting TJ Brown heavily or I'm not targeting the fight at all.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty solid DK take there. Just my opinion on the fight. First of all, this is a really tough spot for Charles Rosa to step into, right? I mean, where it's Thursday night now. The fight got announced, yesterday? They weigh in on Friday morning, fight on Saturday afternoon. Just a really tough spot for anyone to step into, whether or not you fought in the UFC before. It's a short notice debut, or you're a guy like Charles Rosa who's been in the promotion for a decently long amount of time. Sounds like the UFC hooked him up with a new contract, including this fight. So potentially some financial incentive for him to step in here on short notice. Not entirely sure if, he's been training super ready to go, or just one of those things where this was a path for him to kind of carve out a role in the company for a little bit longer. I actually think this is a little bit of a winnable fight for Charles Rosa. Rosa is certainly a flawed fighter, right? His striking is not something to write home about. He kind of throws in these like herky-jerky motions, has the ability to out-kickbox some lower level guys, but certainly not someone you want to rely on to win a strictly kickboxing matchup. And then on the ground, you mentioned it, John, his takedown defense really poor. In his last 5 fights, there have been 23 attempted takedowns against him. He's given up 15 of those takedowns. That's a super poor number. He's been controlled for over 10 minutes in 3 of his last 5 fights. I mean, those come against some really, I would say, higher level grapplers than TJ Brown. Just in the past, I would say like the Derek Minner types obviously had a strong performance. And then guys like Bryce Mitchell, who are super elite on the ground. Even Damon Jackson, his last time out, was able to put Charles Rosa on his back for a significant amount of time. So I'll pick TJ Brown in this spot, but I think your point as to his durability, it's kind of everywhere, right? We saw him get knocked down on the Contender Series, got hurt in his last fight against, the Danny Chavez fight. He took a ton of damage to his leg before he even considered shooting a takedown. Like, at his best, TJ Brown is a takedown machine, but at his worst, he's someone who's liable to get lit up on the feet, and even on the ground. We saw him, like the Jordan Griffin fight, had 7 takedowns in that fight and then get subbed from guard. He's not a guy that you really want to trust. That being said, 10 fight slate, massive favorite, one of the cheapest fighters on the slate in terms of DraftKings. This is not really a spot where I want to overthink it, right? It's not a 15 fight slate where, TJ Brown can win, but he doesn't score well, and we can still get optimal elsewhere if the field owns him at 70%. This is a spot where I kind of lean more towards like hitting the lock button on TJ Brown if you're going to mass multi-enter, or Brian Kelleher, who we'll talk about in our next fight. It's just, if he wins, his pathway to winning is a solid DraftKings score. He's so cheap, and there just aren't a ton of other options that you want to pivot to in this spot. So I like the TJ Brown side here. Not someone that you typically want to trust, but I do think it's a pretty solid matchup for him and a tough spot for Charles Rosa on such short notice. Let's continue here with the theme of short notice replacements and a little bit of wonky DraftKings pricing. Second fight of the night, we got Brian Boom Kelleher. He's currently a minus 315 favorite this weekend. He's $7,500 on DraftKings, and he takes on Kevin Croom, who's stepping up on similar short notice to Charles Rosa. Croom comes back plus 265, $6,700 for Kevin Croom on DraftKings. Croom, kind of a guy who I would say was a regional journeyman for much of his career. He gets a short notice opportunity against Roosevelt Roberts, who was a pretty hyped prospect at the time. Hurts Roberts on the feet, gets a guillotine in his UFC debut, kind of an impressive result. And then against Alex Caceres, got taught the old vet lesson. Just kind of relentlessly pushed for takedowns, gassed out badly in that fight. Really got blown out of the water by a guy like Alex Caceres, who's put together a pretty nice win streak of late. My opinion on this fight is pretty similar to the first one of the evening. Brian Kelleher is someone who I think probably gets more shit than is necessary, right? He's 23-12 professionally, not a guy who has a great record inside of the UFC. But if you kind of go down and see the level of competition that Brian Kelleher is facing, it's pretty, I don't want to say it's easy to call his fights, because if it was, then we'd make money on every single one of his fights in betting. But you look at the guys he's lost to, right? He has 5 UFC losses: Chito Vera, John Lineker, Montel Jackson, Cody Stamen, and Ricky Simone. Those are 5 really solid fighters that he's lost to. I mean, the worst one literally might be Cody Stamen. But on the flip side, his best win in the UFC might be like Hunter Azure in a fight that he was losing and then came back and got a knockout in this middle of the second round. Like, Brian Kelleher consistently beats super low level guys and struggles against upper echelon opponents. I think Kevin Croom certainly fits the mold of a lower level guy. But minus 315 is certainly not a price that I trust Brian Kelleher at. I will say, in terms of DraftKings, similar situation to TJ Brown. I don't know if I would lock both Kelleher and Brown in 100% of lineups, because Kelleher, again, minus 300 favorite, biggest favorite on the slate, and is $7,500 on DraftKings. I would probably choose to lock one of them and then match the field or a little bit overweight on the other one. Just similar situation here with TJ Brown and Brian Kelleher, right? Big favorite, underpriced, likely to score well in a win. Brian Kelleher, historically a good finisher, has a great guillotine. We've also seen him have the ability to string together multiple takedowns, rack up control time. I just think these spots are kind of, I don't want to say he's fail proof, but there's just a lot of ways for Brian Kelleher to get optimal this weekend. And maybe we get different elsewhere and just kind of jam in the best plays here that are pretty obviously mispriced. I mean, it doesn't take much research to figure out that Brian Kelleher is mispriced on DraftKings. John, you mentioned that you were kind of leaning towards the lock button on TJ Brown in terms of DraftKings. What are you doing with the Brian Kelleher situation? Are you comfortable playing both of these guys at what is likely to be mega chalk, or are you kind of prioritizing one over the other? And do you give Kevin Croom a shot here as a live underdog on short notice?
Yeah, I'm definitely with you. I'm not opposed to stacking both of them in most of your lineups. The problem is that's going to be a super popular combination, and we're only dealing with 10 fights as it is. So if everybody's locking the same two guys and we only have 8 other fights to go off of, then you're talking heavily duped lineups. So you have to really be careful with what you're doing with the rest of your lineups. But in terms of this one, like, I mean, it's kind of hard for me not to see Kelleher get the finish here. Kevin Croom is not someone that's super impressive. Yeah, he had the early submission over Roosevelt Roberts that you mentioned, but like outside of him stepping in on short notice, just like he did against Roosevelt Roberts, outside of him just going for it in the first round and getting lucky, outside of that, I really think Kelleher gets the finish here. So I like Kelleher. I think he gets the job done. I think he gets the finish. Whereas the TJ Brown side, it's like you almost don't want him to get the finish. You just want him to land takedowns in volume and to rack up takedown points that way. So I think I'm actually more comfortable locking Kelleher than I am Brown, because Brown has the durability issues, and you almost like you're not counting on him to finish, and he's not like a super great finisher as it is anyway. So I actually think I favor Kelleher, but again, I'm gonna have a lot of both of these combos. It's just you need to be aware with what you're doing with the other 4 fighters in your lineup, and that's going to be the key thing I think this week.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense, right? Like if you're going to prioritize these two guys, you have to understand that you can't just jam in all the other high-owned plays, especially at the upper price tier. One thing I wanted to mention, and we've gotten a lot of questions recently actually about cash games in the MMA DFS format. This is a spot where it's just a no-brainer lock button TJ Brown and Brian Kelleher, right? Like if you're playing a cash game against someone who doesn't have TJ Brown or Brian Kelleher, that's someone, you should be sending the old friend request to on DraftKings. You can invite him to a game. Like those are 2 plays that are just super easy to make in terms of the cash game consideration. And then you can jam in, all the best plays at the top. So I think it's a super straightforward week in terms of cash, which always makes it a little bit more interesting in the GPP streets. Let's move on to the third fight of the night here. We got Court McGee, a small favorite currently at -115 against Ramiz Brahimaj. Depending on where you look in the market, there's prices at Pick'em. I think you could even get Court McGee at -105 in certain places. So closely lined fight here. DK prices have Court McGee at $8.3 thousand. Ramiz Brahimaj comes back $7.9 thousand. And this is an interesting matchup because Ramiz Brahimaj is someone who really underperformed in his debut against Max Griffin, which was a tough matchup, but you watch Brahimaj on his regional scene. He's a guy who's kind of going all out for submissions early in fights. He throws pretty much as hard as he can from the opening bell. And in the Max Griffin fight, he gave us none of that, right? He just kind of stood there, stared at his opponent for the entirety of the fight until his ear basically fell off from Max Griffin and lost via TKO doctor stoppage. On the flip side, comes back, gets an easy win, next fight out, rear naked choke against Sasha Politnikov, who say what you want about the guy, is probably one of the worst grapplers in the UFC. But regardless, first UFC win for Brahimaj, looked a lot better than he did in his debut. And then on the other side, like Court McGee's been around for a really long time. In my opinion, not someone that looks super shot, but has lost 5 of his last 7 matchups. Certainly getting up there in age, 37 years old at 170 pounds is not, a great combination. I'm kind of curious here, John. Are you buying the Brahimaj momentum coming off of the first win in his UFC career, or you backing the veteran here in Court McGee?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting matchup. But before I answer that question, I want to bring up 2 things. One, I want to shout you out because you cashed Max Griffin round 3 prop at like 26-1 or something absurd in that Griffin Brahimaj fight. I figured you were too humble to plug it, so I'll plug it for you. That was a great bet. Obviously, the ear thing was a little gruesome, but still a great bet either way. And then the other thing I was going to say is Brahimaj. This dude, man, like so my barber is always talking to me about like gambling. He's like, yo, what's the play this week in UFC? So like we chat a little bit as he cuts my hair. And I remember before Brahimaj UFC debut, I tell him, hey, there's this guy, he trains out of Fortis, super good. Well, it's not super good, but like super opportunistic grappler. He's first round sub in almost all his fights. Like he's going to go for the sub. Just bet him by sub. FanDuel opened it at like plus 850 or something for the submission line or first round sub. I'm like, yeah, I hit the sub line, hit the first round sub. And he almost never watches the fights. And then he'll just ask me, oh, what happened with that one? And so as I'm watching it, and Brahimaj is just doesn't shoot a single takedown. Obviously, I'm tilted, but I'm like, man, I told my barber literally earlier today. And so I'm like, whatever. He doesn't watch the fights. He'll forget about it. I walked in at my next haircut appointment, and he's like, I watched the fight. The guy didn't try to grapple once. So it was literally like the one time where he actually watched the fights. And I'm like, oh my God. So I was super embarrassing, looked like an idiot, whatever. But I gave him some winners after that. So it's all good. But every time Brahimaj is on a card now, I always think back to that with the barber. And I'm like, oh my God, so brutal. But yeah, so just wanted to point those two things out before I answer your question. I actually think this is one of those spots where it's like you have the older veteran who is kind of on a downward trajectory in terms of their career path. Like he just turned 37, you said. Like he's definitely getting up there, but at the same time, like he's still a tough test for somebody that is lower level in terms of the division, in a guy like Brahimaj who still relies on that submission. Like, yes, against Max Griffin, he didn't, and he kind of looked lost on the feet, and he got beat up. And then he faced Paletnikov, and he just dominated him immediately, cut right through him with the grappling. So are we now just supposed to think that, he's going to do that to Court McGee? Because Court McGee's never been submitted before. Court McGee's pretty well-rounded. Court McGee's likely going to throw more volume. So I kind of like the old vet side, and that's kind of rare for me because you know as well as I do, I'm usually fading those guys, and I don't have any action on this fight, but I am sort of leaning towards the veteran in McGee. Took a look at McGee by decision. I think that's a little bit interesting, but it's just a spot where I think Brahimaj is probably relying on his wrestling and grappling, and I'm just not convinced that he's going to have a ton of success against Court McGee in that area, but I could be wrong. Fortis was certainly like on a roll before the break there, so maybe the camp just comes in and is staying hot in the new year. But yeah, I don't know. It's going to be vet or pass for me on this one.
I'm in a similar boat, and I actually think I'm going to end up playing Court McGee here as my first play. Well, I have one other play that I've already made on the slate, but the more I look into this fight, I actually got lucky. It was nice the couple weeks off. Normally, those of you guys who know me, like I'm always grinding, every sport out there, but I went home for break. I wasn't around the legal sportsbook, the domestic sportsbook area. So I took a little break, didn't tape anything for a while. I got lucky, I came back and all these fights are getting canceled left and right. So I didn't actually do the work on this fight until, last night into this morning. And the more I look at it, I think Court McGee's a pretty solid look against Ramiz Brahimaj in this spot. Brahimaj is just a super raw talent, right? And when he's at his best, he's a guy who's super opportunistic, a guy who's, jumping on every submission out there. He shoots takedowns, has a decent body lock, actually throws with a good amount of power on the feet. I would say that Brahimaj has a good chance to hurt Court McGee in this fight, actually. Court McGee, his last fight out, pretty dominant performance in terms of the scorecard against Claudio Silva, especially in the second round, super dominant round there for Court McGee. But down the stretch, against the gas, Claudio Silva took a couple of shots, didn't exactly love the way he reacted. He, of course, landed a takedown after the fact, and it was a pretty sweat-free win in the end. But you can definitely see the age a little bit on Court McGee. I just think that Brahimaj is a chronic gasser who, if he isn't able to get these early submissions, and sometimes he's not even implementing the game plan where he's going out to the submission, I just think Court is kind of better than him everywhere, right? Like, I don't think that Court McGee is going to get, submitted in this spot. 30 career fights, has never been submitted. Pretty strong takedown defense, like 70%. Was able to get underhooks pretty easily on Claudio Silva, who's not the best wrestler in the world, but you get Claudio Silva in grappling sequences, and that's a place where you don't want to be. And I thought Court McGee in his last fight did a really solid job of avoiding that. And, he fought close with Sean Brady and Carlos Condit. Obviously, Condit has since retired, but that Sean Brady loss where he won the third round was only controlled for like a minute by a guy who appears to be a super strong up-and-coming grappler and maybe top 5, top 10 in this weight class. I think that performance, despite Court McGee losing, has aged decently. So I think I'm actually going to make a play here on McGee. Don't feel great about it at his age, but I just think he's kind of better everywhere and has a cardio advantage. So Brahimaj probably a little bit more athletic, more finishing upside early. two ways I think I'm going to play this fight. Actually, three. I think obviously the Corn McGee money line is a solid look here. You mentioned minus 115. Actually, if you go look at the current market, I see a plus 100 at Caesar Sportsbook. That's the best market, best line currently out there in terms of the domestic sports books like that. I also saw DraftKings is offering the decision only market at Court McGee minus 150. And I just don't really see Brahimaj having the ability to win a decision here. Like, I think he's going to get a finish, or he's in for, getting taken down in the later rounds, gassing out McGee, taking over down the stretch. And likewise to that kind of thinking, I think McGee live could make a lot of sense, right? Brahimaj is 0-3 in fights that leave the second round. He's literally never won one. It's very possible that he starts out looking solid in this spot, but as the fight goes on, I kind of expect the veteran to take over here. So don't feel great about it, but I do think Court McGee will end up being my first bet of 2022. Like the spot here for him a lot. And look, Brahimaj got his first win in the UFC, but gets a really poor grappler. And I think the line is just too much recency bias towards a performance against a really poor opponent in Politnikov. John, anything to add here before we move on to the next fight where I understand you have a hill that you're willing to die on this weekend?
Yeah, I think we could get to it. I'm ready to talk about my guy, Jamie Pickett, this week.
All right, yeah, let's not bury the lead. Next up, we got Joseph Holmes making his UFC debut, coming off of a win on Contender Series and then a regional scene knockout. Currently lined as a minus 150 favorite. He's $8,600 on DraftKings. And then John's boy, Jamie Pickett, comes back plus 130, 7.6K. I won't give too much of an introduction for this fight. John, from what I understand, you've only placed one bet so far for UFC Vegas 46. It happens to be on Jamie Pickett. Talk me through the thought process, my friend.
Yeah, I'm going to go big screen for this one. Hang on. Oh, wrong one. All right. So, I think Jamie Pickett is far and away the best value on the card. I know Jonah, and I'll give you your time because I know you're a big Jamie Pickett hater, but we'll get there. And this could be disclaimer. I did cash Jamie Pickett against Staropoli. So this could be just me trying to ride that train again. But I honestly do think this is a really good spot for him. I bet him at plus 132 for a unit and a half on FanDuel. I think most books are around 120. I think I saw 125 out there. I think any plus money is still good on Jamie Pickett. I line him as a small to moderate favorite in this spot. Holmes is a guy I taped quite a bit for Contender Series this season. Really not impressed with him. Former, very, very athletic, former, I believe, defensive end college football player. Just turned pro only 2 years ago. So still super green. Hasn't really fought anybody. His level of competition is very suspect. A bunch of guys with losing records, 0-1, 3-2. Then he gets the Contender Series shot and fights against Shante Barnes, I think the guy's name was, who was brought on to showcase another fighter who fell off, and then they gave him to Holmes to try to showcase Holmes, and Holmes had this huge size advantage, and he just doesn't know how to use it. Like, outside of just a jab, he really has no level of striking whatsoever. And then he's more of a grappler, but his grappling, like, the technique isn't there. You've seen in previous fights on the regional scene, like, he's falling out of mount. He's slipping off people's back. Like, the technique is just not there, despite the 5 out of his 7 wins coming by submission. So even on Contender Series, he looks lost against Barnes, doesn't really know how to do anything, and then ends up getting the submission finish against a guy who was a terrible grappler, pretty much on Poletnikov's level. And Dana was so not impressed with Holmes that he didn't even give him a contract, even though he got a finish. He's like, oh, well, okay, we'll give you a fight on Looking for a Fight. And Holmes was pissed off on that show. You can go back and watch it. So then he goes on Looking for a Fight. He fights Jonathan Patti, who previously fought on Contender Series, got knocked out by my boy Jamie Pickett. Before that, everybody's been fed Patti. Punahil Soriano, back in the day, Ryan Spahn got him. Like, he's the guy that you feed people to. Another former college football player that just doesn't have a ton of skill. So just because Holmes finished him in the first round, now we're supposed to believe that he's worthy of being a favorite at the UFC level against a guy like Jamie Pickett, who, despite what people think, he is very experienced and very well-rounded. I think he's better than Holmes in legitimately every single area. I think he's a better striker. I think he has better power. I think he's clearly a better wrestler. And I think he's a better grappler. And I think that could be a hot take here because people see Holmes and they're like, oh, well, he has all these submission victories. But look at the guys that he's fighting. These guys have no semblance of grappling whatsoever. Jamie Pickett is a 3-stripe brown belt. We've seen Pickett at least improve in some of his fights at the UFC level. In his last fight against Staropoli, I know it was an ugly fight, but we at least saw him, be more, have more initiative, like blitzing forward at times, looking to wrestle like he always does in all of his fights. I just think there's multiple ways he can win this fight, and I legitimately don't understand why he isn't the favorite in this matchup, because Holmes is just super green. It's always possible he makes improvements. He's training at a good camp now, but I mean, based on what I've seen from him, I legitimately do not understand him being lined as a favorite against Jamie Pickett here. So any plus money is good on Pickett. I'm willing to die on that hill. That's where I'm planting my flag this week. What say you, Jonah?
Yeah, so first of all, we got to give a shout out to the full screen. I mean, new setup for you, John. You got the like the PC in the background. The camera's high quality. I mean, some serious production quality going on behind the scenes. I guess that's what happens when you bank a showdown slate. Oh, and bank some underdog. Casual 6 figures since we last spoke as well. But the studio looks good in the big screen right there.
Thank you, and shout out to Jordan, man. He's helping me with everything, and I'm like clueless with all the tech stuff. So he's the man. You guys should follow him. I think it's at Ordination on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't gonna make a boomer comment there. I was just trying to give you a compliment. But yeah, as I understand, the technology stuff is a work in progress, but it looks good, and I'm sure it'll only get better as time goes on. In terms of how I see the fight between Holmes and Pickett going down this weekend, I like to enter my tape study, my research process without having kind of any opinions. But I mentioned that I kind of waited a long time to get into this card. I saw that you bet Pickett. I saw that you were excited about it in Discord. You hit me up about it or whatever. I gotta be honest. I was expecting like this Holmes guy to be one of the worst fighters because I don't watch contender series like that. Here and there. Obviously, I've had my back and forths with the contender series alum on Twitter or whatnot, but I haven't seen this guy fight. Is my point. I hadn't seen Holmes fight, so I went back, watched his last 3 fights. I really don't think he's that bad, if I'm being completely honest. Guy 6'4", decent kicker. I actually think at distance. You mentioned his jab being his best strike. I actually think his body kick is pretty decent. I will say that I certainly don't think he's like this great grappler, right? 5 of his 7 wins by submission. In the contender series, I thought it was whatever. I didn't think he looked particularly good or bad in contender series. I thought he just kind of was like a middling performance by a regular contender series guy. I will say I went back and watched his fight prior to contender series against Dwayne Diggs. That's the most troublesome fight, in my opinion, for Joseph Holmes, who I actually think has decent takedowns. He's strong, really athletic for the weight class. 6'4" at this weight class is like Israel Adesanya and pretty much nobody else. Like, he's seriously long for the division, which obviously doesn't help takedown defense, which is my next point. In that Diggs fight, he was taken down pretty easily, showed a decent get-up game, I think. His offensive grappling, I actually think, is decent in terms of getting the fight to the ground, and he gets to good positions, but he is over-aggressive, like you mentioned, John. He lost back control and, full mount in that fight against Diggs. That was troublesome to me. I mean, that fight is not even a year old at this point. That's kind of the thing holding me back from making a bet here on Holmes, is I just think, yeah, he's 26 years old. Theoretically, he should be getting a lot better in every fight, but I mean, it's props to the kid for fighting 4 times in 2021, but when you're not having long camps, I feel like it's a little bit hard for fighters to get better. Obviously, he only has 8 pro fights. It's good for him to get in the cage, good for him to accumulate cage time and just get it under his belt. But at the same time, it's been 3 months since his last fight. I'm not sure he's going to be a super improved fighter from when he fought Pati, but I will say, I think his 1-2 is decent. He's long for the weight class, decent body kicks. I'm not going to bet him here just because betting on the lanky guys with poor takedown defense at chalk in their UFC debut coming off a contender series is really not my thing. But I will say that I think he does deserve to be the favorite here against Jamie Pickett. So I'll push back there. I wish you good luck in your bet, of course, since I doubt I get involved. Maybe you convince everyone with the full screen and we'll get to like Joseph Holmes minus 120 and I'll hop on at that point in time. But as of now, I think I'm going to pass. But I think you laid out a good case for Pickett. I kind of think Pickett sucks, and I don't think that Holmes is that much of I don't think he's like a super low level bum who won't win fights at the UFC. Whereas, Jamie Pickett, he isn't either, but I don't think he's some massive step up in competition just because he, has fought in the UFC a few times. He hasn't put on any performances that I would call anything that makes me think he's anything better than kind of just like a mid-level fighter at the top. So I'll give you a chance to come back if you want, or we can move on and just let these two guys settle it in the cage on Saturday. Any last words on your boy Jamie Pickett?
No, that's all fair. And just a disclaimer, I don't think he's more than a mid-level fighter either. I just think that the discrepancy is a lot wider, and that's where I'm at. But yeah, I mean, I totally respect your opinion. We'll see what happens on Saturday.
Yeah, shout out to our boy Nick in the chat. I don't know if I'm gonna. I don't know if I'll call the Giga Kick KO for for Joseph Holmes this weekend, as he commented. But appreciate everyone tuning in for the first show of 2022. Let's move on to another Contender Series alum who finds himself as a favorite. Shout out to me for doing some research over break and doing the stats on the Contender Series alum from last year who fought inside of the UFC. A lot of these guys are lined as favorites. Had a borderline losing record inside the UFC last year. I think something that'll be consistent throughout the first few months of the year as guys get as the Contender Series guys get their first fights in the promotion is Jon has seen all these guys before, has done a lot of work taping them in the past. I have not. So I think it's kind of interesting looking at it from different angles. And I think it's also important to acknowledge like these guys oftentimes are overpriced in the betting market prior to their debuts. And I think that's a situation where we'll be able to make a good amount of money this year. I say right as I advocate for Joseph Holmes being a favorite in his debut. Let's move on here. We got Joe Anderson Brito, another Contender Series alum, as mentioned, minus 130 here, $8.6 thousand against Bill Algeo, who comes back plus 110 for Algeo. He's $7.6 thousand on DraftKings. I'll start here. And look, I think Bill Algeo is a pretty decent fighter in terms of what he brings to the table in volume, right? He throws a lot. Not somebody that's really able to hurt a ton of opponents, but has decent offensive grappling, throws a lot of volume, is able to win minutes on the feet, good cardio, like just a guy who I think is generally solid at the UFC level. The one place where Bill Algeo has really struggled is his takedown defense. And we saw that his last time out in the Ramos fight, right? He was taken down like 8 times. I think he was taken out 4 times in his fight prior to that. That's 12 times over his last 2 fights. Takedown defense near 55%. He has a decent get-up game. You know, he's not someone who gets stuck on bottom for long periods of time. But I went back and watched this Joe Anderson Brito kid. And first of all, he's got a lot of Davis and Figueiredo in him where, first of all, he's like a fantastic cheater, right? Like his fight doesn't even go to the scorecards or goes to the scorecards, but technical decision because he like eye pokes his opponent, put his knee on his opponent's face to break up an armbar on Contender Series. Like just a guy who comes out there, he swings overhands consistently, flying kicks. I've seen him like kick his opponent in the dick like within 30 seconds of the fight starting when going back and watching tape. I mean, seriously, like a grade A cheater is Brito, but also a guy who's super athletic, I think, and a pretty good wrestler. And he has a style that you would think would really gas him out. But he's been a pretty good finisher. You know, he gets on top, conserves energy decently well while still throwing a good amount of ground and pound. I actually think Brito is not as impressive as some people seem to think he is. Like I've seen some people say he's like the best fighter to come off Contender Series this year. And Jon, I'll let you voice your opinion on that. Personally, I didn't watch the whole show, but to me, I would be pretty shocked if this is like the best guy. The show would be worse than I thought if this is the best talent to come off of it this year. I think Brito is decent. He's athletic. He's strong. I like Algeo theoretically in this matchup. It's just tough to pull the trigger on a guy at plus 110 where you know he's going to get taken down, right? He has poor takedown defense. We know Brito's going to shoot a takedown early in the fight. Yeah, Brito's a guy who gasses out throughout fights. It might be somebody who I look to fade in the future because I think his cardio might be a liability. But for now, you know, Bill Algeo's got to show me something. You can't get taken down 8 times by Ricardo Ramos and expect me to bet you at anywhere close to even money against someone who I expect to shoot takedowns, a guy who I think is physically stronger than him. So I'll pick Brito here. I picked 2 Contender Series guys in the first 2 fights of the year for 2022. Jon, a little out of character for me.
New year, new Jonah.
Hopefully not. If I'm betting on a lot of Contender Series guys, someone's got to come check on me. But anything for you in this fight, Jon? Do you like the Brito side? What do you think of him as a prospect?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny, like the early look ahead, like one of the first weeks after break, you know, when we saw this fight get lined originally, it was like, oh, you know, this could be an Algeo spot. And then like going back, you know, you remember what Brito did on Contender Series, what he's done in his previous fights. You know, this is really a difficult matchup for him. You know, I was impressed with Brito coming into that Contender Series fight. I bet him he was actually an underdog in that fight, which was crazy. Diego Lopez isn't a bad fighter either, but there's no way Brito should have been an underdog in that spot. And he ended up closing like a small favorite or even money, something like that. But originally he was a sizable underdog. Those lines jump all over the place. But this matchup, Bill Algeo, like, you know, Algeo's my guy, but this just seems like a really tough spot for him. You mentioned the takedown defense. That's a major concern for me. He is a black belt, but, we haven't really seen him use that grappling at the UFC level. I doubt he can do it here against Brito, who's also a pretty competent grappler in his own right and has the wrestling and control to go along with it. So I just have concerns that Algeo could get stuck on his back here for, you mentioned the get up games. Like, I don't know if he'll get stuck on his back for extended periods, but enough to swing rounds, basically. And that's my concern. And like you said, it's close to, well, now Brito's taking enough money. It's like minus 135 or whatever. But before, it was close enough to pick him. And even at minus 135, it's still lined as an even fight. And I got to favor the guy that I think is going to land takedowns, the guy who's probably more powerful on the feet and is probably more likely to finish as well. So I like the Brito side. No bet for me because I think the line's kind of gotten away from us. But in terms of DraftKings, I think he sets up as a pretty strong play in that, what is he, 8,600 or something?
Yeah, 8,600.
86. Okay. So yeah, so he sets up as a pretty strong play. We expect him to land takedowns. Decent chance at getting a finish here. So yeah, I like the Brito side for sure.
Yeah, two more things to add quickly on this fight. First of all, if Jon is picking against his boy Bill Algeo, that means that he seriously has some conviction on the other side. Jon and I, we've been doing the show for like over a year together at this point, like a year and a half. We have on his Instagram account at Jon Kelly DFS, we have one DM between the two of us, and it's Jon sending me a picture of Bill Algeo before his UFC debut, hitting pads with Henry Hooft, and it says, low-key think he knocks out Lamas. Obviously, he
almost did. Yeah, he almost did.
Exactly. He certainly had his opportunities in that fight. Pretty good showing, in his debut. I think it was short notice. That's why you sent it to me. But obviously, like, you've been a fan of the guy. Someone's jacking in the chat. He isn't a real Philly guy, but I think Jon still reps the Bill Algeo.
Yeah, he's like a PSU guy. He's from up by Penn State there, State College, I think.
Yeah, but he's still your boy, is my point.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you're against him here. Last thing that I wanted to mention is in terms of a comp for this fight, Bill Algeo did a really good job, I thought, at kind of neutralizing Spike Carlisle, who's a similar fighter to Brito in the sense that, he's decent everywhere, hits with power, has decent takedowns, poor cardio. I kind of think Algeo did a really good job in that matchup, just kind of neutralizing the danger coming at him and just making it a fight where he fought, no Bill Algeo fight is like super composed, but I think he did a good job kind of fighting that fight at his own pace and doing a good job keeping his a dangerous opponent at bay. So I'll just mention, I think that bodes well for Algeo here. I think the price is pretty accurate. Brito is a small favorite. Makes sense. Sounds like we're both picking him to win. Let's move on here to the next fight. We got another Contender Series alum making his debut. We got Vyacheslav Borschev. I believe he goes by Slava. He's minus 180 favorite, $9,000 on DraftKings against Dakota Bush, who comes back plus 155, 7.2K for Bush's second fight in the UFC, following a loss to Austin Hubbard on short notice in his debut. Jon, do you want to go first here? Any insight on Slava? Won by knockout on the Contender Series early in the second round. Seems to be a pretty high-level striker. Anything you could tell us about him?
Yeah, all these Dana White Contender Series fights, you see my eyes light up because I'm just like, this is amazing. I don't have to do that extra tape study because I've already done it recently. But yeah, I mean, we actually have a few more coming up next week, and we lost like Kleitson Rodriguez, Vanessa Demopoulos versus somebody else. So I mean, a bunch of fights.
Did Demopoulos fight? I thought she was like
she's fought in the UFC
girl
before, but was she fought on Contenders too, though, like a couple fights ago, I think. But either way,
I can't remember. Regardless.
Yeah, there's just a lot of contenders this week and next, so I'm excited. But Slava Claus, yeah, I think he's a really obviously a good striker. Former Glory kickboxing champion. Is it Glory or Strike Force? One of the two. High-level striker, clearly has knockout power, trains at Team Alpha Male, so you hope that the rest of the MMA game is coming along. But honestly, there are still holes in his game. I have super concerns about his defensive wrestling. In multiple fights, even in LFA or on the regional scene. I think there was one fight in LFA against, was it Will Starks?
For Borschev?
Yeah, I might be thinking of somebody else.
Well, Will Starks that's like his only loss, the one that went to decision.
Okay, yeah. So it is that fight.
Yeah.
So he got taken down in like every round in that fight, and Borschev is a guy who's not good at working back to his feet. Like he's not horrible at it, but a lot of those times, like when he's taken down, he's stuck on his back for like at least a minute. So there are definitely someone's going to get him in the UFC. I can almost guarantee that. But when the fight plays out on the feet, he is very dangerous. You know, he's similar to Giga Chikadze, who we'll talk about in the main event, in that when it's on the feet, like he's a bad dude. But you know, you have concerns about the wrestling, the grappling, the cardio. Those are all the same concerns I have with Borschev here. And do I think that this matchup is going to be able to take advantage of that? I really don't. So this is kind of a spot where I think Borschev wins, but he's definitely on my radar to fade in the future. I don't have any interest in the underdog here. I'm blanking. Dakota Bush. Yeah, in Dakota Bush. Bush is just a guy who, I mean, he does have a little bit of wrestling. I don't trust him to use it. He hasn't. Who did he fight in his last fight? Man,
well, he fought Hubbard. I mean, he tried.
Hubbard. So he tried, but by the time he tried, he was like gassed out. Like in round 1, he was just like spamming everything on the feet. Like, and then by the time he tried to wrestle, he was so tired, he didn't do anything in rounds 2 and rounds 3. But even on the regional scene, like Bush isn't like some high level wrestler, doesn't even really always look to wrestle. So I just think Borschev probably hurts him and knocks him out here. And then we can look to fade Borschev in the future in a better spot.
Yeah, it's interesting. I will note real quick in terms of the cardio in that short notice debut for Dakota Bush was on short notice. You know, I would pay someone like an obscene amount of money to have a database that holds when fights were announced, because it feels like we have so many short notice call-ups now. It's hard to keep in mind like when the fight was announced. I believe I just went back and searched that Hubbard took the fight against Dakota Bush on April 12th, and then they fought on April 17th. So it was like 5 days notice, a little bit of an explanation for why he gassed out kind of down the stretch of that fight. But I think a lot of your points were right. I mean, Slav is pretty clearly, I think Slav is a pretty elite striker. His kicks to multiple levels. His hooks are pretty tight on the feet, carries a lot of power, it seems. I will say his wrestling looks like next level bad. There's the regional fight where he lost, got taken down every round. Even on Contender Series, you know, there are these 2 takedown attempts where he doesn't make any attempt to sprawl. He doesn't even go for an underhook. He just kind of accepts that he's going for a ride. And then it's not even like he has a strong get-up game, you know, kind of took a weird sequence to get his opponent off of him, and then he gets back up to the feet to end the round against Chris Duncan. Obviously knocks him out early in the second round. So I think Slava's a good enough fighter to kind of cover a price like -180 against Dakota Bush, especially if they're just going to stand and trade. But down the line, you know, this is someone who we need to see serious improvements for him to win a lot of fights at the UFC level against better opponents than a Dakota Bush, who I'm not sure is going to win many fights at the UFC level. So I kind of expect these guys to go out there and bang, and you got to favor the guy in Slava who I think has better striking repertoire overall and carries more power, just a better overall striker. So we agree on that spot. -180, not sure I'm going to lay that. It's hard to lay -180 when the guy has the potential to be a massive liability. Like theoretically, Dakota Bush could shoot a takedown in the first minute of the fight and get 5 minutes of top control and then do the same thing in round 2. You know what I mean? Like it's not. Yeah, so go ahead.
I was going to say that's why it's so hard, is because you can go the other way and be like, well, if Dakota Bush doesn't shoot any takedowns, then Slava looks like -350 at least. You know what I mean? So it's kind of hard to line him in this fight, but I don't know. I'm kind of with you. I think more than likely he probably covers the price tag, probably knocks him out.
Yeah, it's just one of the things where it's very binary. I choose to be a little bit more risk averse in these scenarios where I'm just not going to lay chalk on someone who I'm not sure is trustworthy in this regard. Let's move on to our next fight, which is a rematch of a fight that happened a few years ago. We got Caitlin Chookagian. She's a -180 favorite in this spot against Jennifer Maia. Let me quickly update the banner for this fight. We got Chookagian currently as a -180 favorite. Maia comes back +155. The DK prices here. We got Maia at 7.3K. I will find Chookagian's Draftkings price here in a second. I don't have a ton of analysis for this fight. You know, I went back and watched their first fight, obviously pretty familiar with both women, have both gotten title shots in this pretty barren division that Valentina Shevchenko is going to hold the title for a long time, I think. And both of them kind of got blown out of the water by Valentina. I will say that Maia won a round, which was like a big deal. And then we were able to make a lot of money if you bet Shevchenko live at -300. And then she covered with relative ease. Their first fight, pretty basic. You know, Caitlin Chookagian did her thing at distance, right? Like she made a lot of noises. She jabbed. She stood really far away from her opponent. She kicked the air a few times, and she outstruck her opponent pretty easily. Jennifer Maia lands a takedown in round 3. Wasn't able to land takedowns earlier in the fight, but didn't do a ton of attempting of takedowns. Pretty classic fight for both fighters. You know, Chookagian wins fights marginally on the feet, and Maia mostly loses until she shoots takedowns. I think Chuk is a comfortable favorite. Makes sense. Like we literally saw this fight play out. I don't think either fighter has changed a ton since then. I would expect Maia to obviously shoot takedowns maybe a little bit more often in this fight and probably earlier than the third round because she has the ability to win minutes in this fight if she's able to get on top. But I think Chookagian is a big favorite. Makes sense. I will say one thing that kind of stood out to me here. Don't love laying big prices, and I'm not a big parlay guy, but I will say these two women have combined for 20 UFC fights. 17 of them have hit the judges' scorecards, and the 3 that haven't are Maia submitted an armbar over Joanne Calderwood, and then Chookagian's been finished twice by Jessica Andrade once, and then Valentina Shevchenko the other time. Maia super tough, went the distance with Valentina. Price is like currently minus 330 on the fight to go the distance. Honestly, I think there's probably value there. I don't know if I'm going to look to play it straight, but if you're someone who's like looking for a favorite to parlay something with, I think to go the distance here is probably in the 80 to 85% range. So that's just one thing to note on this fight. Jon, anything from you here in Chookagian versus Maia?
No, nothing for me. I'm with you. I mean, it's kind of hard. They only fought 2 years ago. Like I get that they're not exactly the same fighters, but they're not that different either. Like I really think the fight plays out pretty similarly. You mentioned the only real difference here is if Maia comes in and just decides she wants to wrestle. But she even tried earlier than the third round in that first fight, and Chikadze did a good job of pummeling against the cage, defending the takedowns, and just getting back to her range. She has a 4-inch reach advantage here. I just think it's going to play out like a lot of those boring Chookagian fights do, where she fights from the outside. She uses that length. You know, as boring as it is for us, like she's really good at what she does, and she does have a high fight IQ. She's very smart in that she knows that when she's making those it's sounding good to the judges, even if she doesn't land clean. She's doing things towards the end of the rounds to try to cement rounds in competitive rounds. And I think that's just what she's going to do here. Like even in that first fight, she didn't blow Maia away in really any of those rounds. But at the end of the round, you're like, okay, that round was probably Chookagian. Right. Like, even though it was competitive. And I just think that's what happens again here. So Chookagian at minus 180 or whatever, I think that's about right. If you're a sick pup and you do want action on this fight, I would just play her by decision, because I think the decision line was like 50 cents better or something like that. I don't know why you just wouldn't play her by decision. You mentioned the combined between the two of them, they always go to decision. I think Chookagian's had like 13 UFC fights. Every single one that she hasn't been finished has gone to decision. Yeah. So I mean, I don't think she's finishing her on the feet. She doesn't have enough power, and she has a decent ground game, but that it's always defensive grappling. You know, she never offensively grapples outside of
the Shevchenko fight.
Yeah,
my favorite fade,
Antonina against Antonina, when she Habib Antonina. But outside of that, you know, that brought her takedown average from 0.00 up to like 0.28 across her career. So I think it just plays out as a striking match. Maybe Maia tries to wrestle a little bit. I don't trust her to do so. And Chookagian honestly has shown pretty solid takedown defense as well. So I think it's Chookagian. I think it's Chookagian by decision. But at 8,700 on DraftKings, I have no interest. I'll probably take a few shots on the underdog depending on how many lineups I make. But yeah, I think overall it's a pretty easy pass.
Yeah, let's move on to featured bout on the main card. Honestly, the most exciting fight on the entire card, in my opinion. I do love the flyweights. We got Brandon Royval making his return to the cage. Here's a minus 170 favorite. He's $8,800 on DraftKings. He takes on Rogerio Bontorin, who comes back plus 145. $7,400 on DK is Bontorin. This is the only fight that I placed a bet so far on for the card. Like I mentioned earlier in the show, do think I'll have a bet in Court McGee in some facet, maybe add to it live as well. But I already bet the under 2.5 rounds in this fight between Royval and Bontorin. I got it at minus 160 earlier in the week. Don't think there's a ton of room. I see some sites have like minus 170s. I think that's kind of on the fringe of where I would like stop playing it, but probably still good about minus 170 in this spot in the under 2.5. And the reasoning for the play is just, I think I'm going to just keep slamming Brandon Royval unders. I mean, they haven't failed me yet. 4 UFC fights, 4 fights that never really seemed like they ever had a shot at going to the scorecards once they began. Kind of the ultimate killer be killed fighter in the regards where he has the ability to submit opponents. He hits, I wouldn't say he hits hard, but he hits from crazy different angles. So it's a ton of output, has the ability to break opponents and win via knockout like that. Also somebody who is susceptible to getting taken down, right? The things we want when we play unders is someone who could A, finish a fight, and someone who could B, get finished. And that's what Brandon Royval is, right? He can finish you by KO or submission. He could also get knocked out, right? He keeps his hands super low, gets hit really hard. It was the Moreno fight he got hurt in. He gets hurt in pretty much every fight because of the way he stands and the way he just moves forward relentlessly. And yeah, he has pretty solid submissions. He's got 8 wins via submission, but not a guy who I think is like the strongest technical grappler in the world, not someone who prioritizes position over submission. That's for sure. A guy who will always latch on to some sort of limb and go for a sub, which is super exciting and great for an under because there's a chance he ends up, underneath a guy like Bontorin who has 11 submissions in his own right. And Bontorin, if you're wearing a gi, I think is probably a better grappler than Brandon Royval on the mat. But in MMA, Brandon Royval brings all these elements to the table that don't really think Bontorin does in terms of just throwing up wild submissions, the ability to really push a crazy pace. Bontorin in the Kattar France fight seems to be slowing down after getting to a dominant position early on in the matchup. Bontorin hits hard. Royval's susceptible to getting hit. I think Royval wins. Tough guy to lay minus 170 on. I do love the raw dog, but I don't know. It's a tough to lay minus 170 price on the guy who's just going to kind of walk in with reckless abandon and try to make it as much of a firefight as possible. So I'll opt for the under here at the same price as Royval money line. I just think the under is slightly stronger. Played it for a unit under 2.5 minus 170. That's my only play so far on the card. John, anything for you here? Draftkings, side total, anything for you in this matchup between the flyweights?
Not yet, but I really want to bet my guy Brandon Royval, but I can't do it. Like you said, at minus 172, I think is at FanDuel. Like, give me a minus 150, I'll get involved. So maybe we can, let's hype up the Bontorin side here. Maybe we can get somebody to play Bontorin enough to make this line get a little bit closer. But I like the Royval side, I really do. But like you said, it's hard. Guys like that where they're so like almost finish reliant and just really like just a wild card. You can't really trust them to cover their price tag, even if you favor them in matchups. So that's why we say it's difficult to lay a minus 170. However, I do favor him in the matchup. I think he's a better grappler. I think he's probably a better striker over 3 rounds than Rogerio Bontorin, who you mentioned does have the power, but we've seen it in pretty much all of his fights. He starts to slow down a lot, doesn't throw as much, and really starts to gas out. And this is a guy who's always struggled to make the weight. Who knows what he looks like tomorrow on the scales or if he makes the weight. That's going to be something to keep an eye on. But yeah, I just think Royval's a guy who I like a lot of what he does, but it's also like, again, he's a wild card. And similar to Bill Algeo, who we talked about before, like those guys fight with their hands down. They're always, worried about the offense where they just completely disregard the defense. And somebody that's powerful enough is going to catch them and make them pay at some point. I don't think Bontorin's the guy to do that, but I'm not like super convinced that he's not the guy to do that either. So I do favor Royval. I'll have more exposure to Royval. At the current line, I don't have a play either way, but yeah, it's a good fight to target on DraftKings on a 10 fight card.
For sure. Let's move on to the co-main event here. I kind of can't believe that this fight is the co-main. Like I've always say on this show, I'm not one to complain about the bout order because I know damn well that me and you, John, and everybody watching the show is going to be sitting down from the first prelim to the main event this weekend, but don't really know how you give the heavyweights the co-main here when you've got like Caitlin Chookagian who fought for a title, granted not the most exciting fighter in the world, and Brandon Royval on a card, and you somehow arrive at Chase Sherman being the co-main. But that is where we are at. We got Jake Collier, a minus 130 favorite currently against Chase Sherman in this matchup. The current prices in the betting market are Collier minus 130, Sherman plus 108. DK prices have Collier a more expensive fighter, obviously $8.5 thousand, and Sherman comes back at 7.7K. And John, my New Year's resolution this year was to try to avoid betting on as many of these type of fights as possible, where we've just got kind of low level heavyweight guys who similar styles are just going to kind of go out there and sling it. Neither one is huge power, I would say. So it takes away a little bit of the volatility of a heavyweight matchup, but a lot of opinions, it seems, from people in the MMA Twitter community this weekend on this fight. I'm not sure I have a super strong one. Collier actually has decent stats at heavyweight in terms of his striking output. He throws a lot, doesn't get hit a ton. I played him against Carlos Felipe in his last fight, which I still think he won, and he clearly outstruck his opponent. But the optics on Collier are bad, man. Like he slows down, he moves backwards. Like I don't want to give judges a break and be like, oh, the guy who's moving forward should always win. But watching the fight back, I was less confident that Collier definitely won the fight. than I was watching it live. It's just one of those things where like the optics are poor on this guy. I don't like how he does that later on in fights, and he doesn't carry a ton of power for heavyweight. And like obviously not a guy who's fought at heavyweight his whole career. If you don't have heavyweight power at heavyweight, which is I think something we're going to be talking about a lot next week with Cyril Gane versus Francis Ngannou, you could be the most skilled guy in the world, but there's so much finish equity that happens at heavyweight. So many fights end via knockout that if you, I'm not saying Collier can't knock out Chase Sherman, but if you don't carry a ton of knockout power, it's hard to really cover like big favorite prices at heavyweight. Not that minus 130 is crazy. Chase Sherman, on the other hand, he like shit on Ike Villanueva a year or two ago, and outside of that has looked pretty poor. The Parker Porter performance, who else has he fought? He fought Orlovsky, didn't look good in that matchup either. Just kind of content, opposite of Collier. He's kind of content to get outstruck, but I guess has better visuals doing it, and he kicks the leg a little bit. I don't know. If it feels like a toss-up heavyweight fight to me, I'll favor Collier. He's got better striking stats. I trust him to do more, but not a fight where I really have any interest in getting involved. John, anything for you in the betting market? And then I'm kind of curious here, your take for DraftKings. This is the only heavyweight fight on the card. We have two guys at low prices who are really strong plays that we talked about earlier on the show, and TJ Brown and Brian Kelleher, obviously a main event that the winner should score well in. Are you prioritizing this fight? Because this kind of feels like the spot to me where if either of these guys carry significant ownership, and it's only Thursday night, we don't have super strong ownership projections, but I'm kind of looking to get underweight on this fight. Like I could see this being the classic heavyweight slot fest decision. And I think in a week where I'm comfortable eating some chalk at certain price points, I don't think I'm going to want to play much of Jake Collier or Chase Sherman, especially if they're going to come in with substantial ownership. So kind of curious your overarching thoughts between betting and DFS on this the co-main event here.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on the matchup, so I'll answer your question. I mean, I'm right there with you. I plan to be underweight to this fight. I think Collier as a small favorite is probably right, just on the sense that he has better cardio, and I think that alone might make him a small favorite here. Sherman, decent output early on, but tends to fade. Probably, I mean, definitely more power than Collier. So I think in terms of DraftKings, if I have to choose a side, it's going to be Chase Sherman, the vanilla gorilla, just because he's more likely to get a knockout finish. You mentioned like this is going to be a stand and trade affair. Sherman has never landed a takedown in the UFC. And Jake Collier hasn't landed a takedown since like 2015 or something like that, when he was at a totally different weight class. So and it might have been before that. I don't know if that's the right year or whatever. But either way, these guys are going to stand and trade. I favor Collier just based on durability and cardio, but it's not a strong take for me either way. I'll have more exposure to Sherman on DraftKings. But overall, like you said, if this is going to be a fight that people target, I'm definitely going to be lower than the field on this one.
Sweet. Not much else to add here. Let's move on to the main event here. We got Giga Chikadze in his second consecutive main event as a betting favorite here. Pretty substantial betting favorite here. Minus 230. He's $9,300 on DraftKings against Calvin Kattar, who is coming off of a beating against Max Holloway that was almost a year ago to the day. I believe that was the first fight UFC on ABC 1 of 2021 on January 16th. They're now fighting January 15th this year. So 364-day layoff for Calvin Kattar. Comes back as a pretty substantial underdog in this spot. Plus 195, $6,900 for Kattar here as the underdog. I'll start by saying this. I'll go first on the fight, John, and then I'll let you close out the show after this. But look, I think Giga Chikadze is like a bona fide, really, really elite striker at this point in time at 145 pounds. There's maybe a guy or two in the world, Max Holloway, Alex Volkanovski types that I would favor over him in MMA striking matchups. Like I just think that Volkanovski does a good job piecing together the entirety of the MMA striking game plan. And Holloway, I just think, is an elite kickboxer in general. But Giga Chikadze, I was there live for the Edson Barbosa fight. And I bet Edson in that spot obviously took it on the chin. But just one of those spots where, like, I think that was a real, not necessarily a passing of the torch, but Giga is not a guy who I've really been high on historically, right? Poor cardio, he's been taken down, put in bad positions before. But in terms of pure kickboxing, like I just am not sure there's that many guys that are going to be able to compete with him on the feet. And out kickboxing Edson Barbosa the way he did, kind of, I think, show that as Barbosa, a guy who has kind of been the kicker in the division for a really long time at 145 pounds. And at this point in time, that might be Giga's time to become the kicker of the weight class. I will say that Giga's kicking is really elite. Obviously has a few leg kicks, the Giga kick to the body, and then his left head kick is kind of his favorite strike to throw on the feet. I will say that his hands, I think, are substantially behind his feet, right? We talk about guys as like some really elite all-around kickboxer, and which I just mentioned I think Giga is, but I definitely think his kicking game is way better than his boxing game, which is what's interesting here with Calvin Kattar, if I was to construct a fighter to beat Giga Chikadze, it would certainly be a wrestler, right? It's certainly going to be someone who's going to grind him against the cage, make him work hard, tire out his gas tank, not let him get off at kicks at distance. But Calvin Kattar is kind of the opposite of that. He's like a very prototypical boxer. He likes to hang in the pocket, throw some decent elbows, but he's just a very basic boxer and a good boxer at that. So while I want to fade Giga with someone who I think is more likely to shoot takedowns and has a more well-rounded game, I am interested in Calvin Kattar in the boxing range just because I do think that, Calvin hits hard and he is solid in the pocket. And Giga struggled there a little bit in the fight against Edson Barbosa. Like Edson, not someone who's known for having great hands. I thought he was clearly the better boxer in that matchup, pressured him well in the second round, Edson did. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting matchup here. I wanted to touch on one thing before I hand it off to you, John. First of all, I'm going to pick Giga in this spot. No bet for me. I think the price is a little bit, you're certainly buying high on Giga, right? He's coming off of his first main event, wins via knockout. He's put together, an 8-fight, 7-fight win streak inside of the UFC. Has fought some really low-level competition, but is slowly ramping up, right? The Cub Swanson fight. Like Jamie Simmons to Cub Swanson is a really big step up. And then Edson Barbosa, obviously in his first main event, is a substantial step up as well. I think he gets another step up here in Calvin Kattar. One thing I wanted to mention, I've kind of seen this narrative throughout fight week that, Calvin Kattar closed plus 120 against Max Holloway. How could he ever be plus 220 against Giga Chikadze? And I think it's interesting because there's two ways to look at it. The first way to look at it is to think, well, the closing market had him at plus 120. So how could he possibly be plus 220 in this spot after, everything we knew went into the market and we saw that Holloway was only a small favorite and we know Holloway's better than Giga or would be favored against Giga, whatnot. The other way to look at it is like Calvin Kattar took a lifetime beating. Like that was one of the ass whoopings of the year in that matchup. And Max looked like a tremendous favorite. I bet Max Holloway in that spot. I didn't expect him to win like 100-0 the way he did it. You know what I mean? So I think it's interesting. One thing I'll mention is I don't think you can treat MMA like you can some other markets. Tonight the Warriors played against the Bucks in NBA, and the Bucks closed like 1-point favorites. You simulate this game, and the Bucks are winning by 40 or 50. I don't know. I stopped keeping track when we went live, but regardless, the Bucks are blowing out the Warriors right now after closing 1-point favorites. In a sport like NBA, if we simulate that game tomorrow, we have the same players out. Draymond isn't playing, whatnot. Same location, the line is not going to be that much different. Even if the Bucks were to win by 100, they'll be like -1, -1.5 tomorrow. That's just how the market works. There's 82 games in a season. We have a really strong idea for how good teams are. In MMA, it's a little bit different. I don't think you can just straight look at Calvin Kattar and say, this guy was plus 120 against Max Holloway. How could he ever be plus 220 now? There was a material change, man. Like he took a really serious beating in that fight and clearly looked like a big underdog. But at the same time, I do give a little bit of credence to the market looking back at it. I guess what I'm saying is I think you're definitely buying high on Giga and potentially selling low on Calvin Kattar. Like, I don't know if we would ever get it to a time in these two guys' career where Giga is going to be this big of a favorite over Calvin. He's coming off of the absolute peak of his first main event win, and Calvin is coming off of the worst loss of his career. I just think that's interesting when you're looking into the market. But stylistically, I think it's a pretty good fight for Giga. Maybe Calvin takes over down the stretch if he's able to extend the fight. Kind of tax that cardio, but long-winded breakdown from me. I just think it's a really interesting strikers matchup this weekend. John, give me your thoughts here on the main event to close us out here for UFC Vegas 46.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was a guy who bet Calvin Kattar in that spot against Max Holloway, and it was a terrible bet. And so that's why it's like, well, if you bet him against Max Holloway, you have to bet him now against Giga. Well, no, you don't, because if you thought it was a bad bet after watching the Max Holloway fight, and this is not stylistically a good matchup for Calvin, you don't have to bet him, even though the number's better. And, we say it all the time, like styles make fights, and this is not a great matchup for him. Like, I do still believe that Calvin Kattar is one of the better boxers in the division, but Giga is clearly one of the better strikers in the division. Like, he's going to have a reach advantage here. He's going to have the legs. He's going to be kicking Calvin Kattar, who's pretty much, like you said, a one-dimensional boxer. We know he's not going to land takedowns. We know he's not going to grapple. And those are ways that we want to take advantage of Giga. Like, like you, like we've kind of been lower on Giga historically, but now it's to the point where like, okay, like we give in. Like he's one of the better strikers.
Unless he fights Max
in the
or
division.
Alex, then I don't give in. Then I hold
no. Yeah, no, that's a whole nother tier. Max proved against Calvin that is a whole nother level, and Giga is not there yet, at least in my opinion. But we want to fade Giga with a wrestler, a grappler, or like you said, if he gets a title shot, whatever. But against Calvin Kattar, yes, the number's nice. I do want to back Kattar again just as a fanboy, but it's like stylistically, I really don't think this is a great matchup for him. The only thing I'll say is that, if this fight were to go 5 rounds, I definitely favor the cardio of Calvin Kattar, because that's one thing we can't even dispute. This is the undisputed MMA show. We can't even dispute that Giga Chikadze does not have the cardio, because he tends to slow down and gas in 3-round fights. And those are 3-round fights where he's not even pushing a high pace. So now he's going to go up against a guy who does push a high pace, who does throw in volume, who can go 5 rounds and keep up that pace across 5 rounds. So those are the positives when you look at a guy like Calvin Kattar at plus 200, somewhere in that range, where it's like, okay, if this does go 5 rounds, I for sure favor Kattar in rounds 4 and rounds 5. So it's just like, can we trust him to fight his own game plan in the first couple rounds and not like it? We talk about a lot with Ciryl Gane, who we'll talk about next week. When people face Giga Chikadze and guys like Ciryl Gane, they get stuck fighting those guys' games. And that's kind of what I worry about with Calvin Kattar here in this spot. It's like, if I bet Kattar at plus 200, yeah, I'm getting a good number, better cardio, real good boxer. I favor him in the later rounds. But then it's like, come Saturday and we see him just sitting at range waiting and getting kicked to death by Giga, and it's like, why did I bet Calvin Kattar? So right. I've kind of been back and forth on it all week. I wanted to hear your thoughts on it and some other people that I respect. I do want to back Kattar, at least in terms of DraftKings, just because the pricing discrepancy is so wide, and because Giga needs a finish at, what is he, 9,300 or something on DraftKings?
He's 9,300, and everyone's going to play him because everyone's going to play TJ Brown at lower prices and Brian Kelleher.
You have the money to play him. He's the main event. He's coming off of a couple knockouts, and against Edson Barboza, where, yes, I tried to fade him too, just like you on Edson Barboza. And that was the spot. That was the prove it spot. So he proved it then. So now it's like, do I really want to go there again with Calvin Kattar? And I still kind of do, because I'm a sick pup, but I don't know if I can do it. But in terms of DraftKings, I am going to take that stance because, like you said, everyone's going to play him. You have the money. But he's 9,300. We have to remember he's not historically a high output guy. So you're really relying on what, a first or second round finish to pay off that price in terms of DraftKings. Probably. And then on the flip side, Kattar's probably not going to be super popular. We favor him in the later rounds. If he wins, all he has to do is win at his price tag. So in terms of DraftKings, I'm fine with leaving money on the table. I'm fine with targeting Calvin Kattar. Giga pretty much needs a round 1 or round 2 knockout against a guy who, by the way, has never been knocked out in his career, who, by the way, just took a lifetime beating against Max Holloway and still didn't get knocked out over 5 rounds. So it's just something where I'm not super confident in the matchup or picking the winner, but I am confident that Giga is going to be over-owned relative to what I think he's going to do in terms of DraftKings.
Yeah, fair enough. One thing I just want to mention, maybe a live bet on Calvin Kattar sounds like something you might be interested in just based on your breakdown of the fight. Last thing, in terms of DK, Giga obviously needs to score well in order to be, meet his, 10x value or whatever you're shooting for. I will say this slate operates a little bit differently than a normal traditional slate, just because there's a solid chance that like 70% of the field is going to get 80 to 100 points locked in from both Brian Kelleher and TJ Brown at low prices. So yeah, I advocate for leaving money on the table in GPPs this week. It's a good way to get different. I'll just say like Giga Chikadze could score 75, 85 and be optimal in this spot, especially because the other high price fighters like Borschev is $300 less. And then there's like Katlyn Chookagian, who's never put up an optimal score in her entire career. So just one of those things where I think at some point, maybe the idea of just getting raw points in your lineup makes sense, but I don't know if I would play like a Giga, TJ Brown, and Brian Kelleher lineup. You're eating a lot of chalk just in terms of lineup construction there, but that's something we'll touch on throughout the Discord at FTN Daily throughout the week, I would think.
Yeah, and I feel like we totally, after me talking about Katlyn Chookagian being a bad DK play, and then you just putting the nail in the coffin saying she's never been optimal, I feel like we just cursed it on such an ugly slate with only 10 fights to where now we're going to get like 240 significant strikes from Katlyn Chookagian, and she's going to be optimal this week.
Well, I'm actually lying too, because like the Antonina fight, she scored like 115 or something like that.
Okay,
she took her down like 3 times, but whatever. The point remains. That's all I got for the main event, John. Anything from you before you take us out of here?
No, that's it, man. 10 fight card. Like we said, you got to just think of ways to get unique guys. Everybody's going to be looking to play the same combination of at least 2 or 3 fighters, like we mentioned. So that's the main thing for this week. I would say scale it back just because it's going to be an ugly slate. Even if you have a good lineup, you're probably chopping it with a few people, especially if you're in the main GPP on DraftKings. So keep that in mind. We have a banger slate. Hopefully it stays together next week for UFC 270. Thanks for joining, guys. If you stayed this long and you didn't hate the video, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, smash the subscribe button, and we'll see you guys next week. This is the Undisputed MMA Show presented by the FTN Network. Good luck, and we will see you guys next time.